we're going to do now is introduce, it's my pleasure to introduce them, Mel Duncan and John Reuwer, and I'm going to read a little bio on each of these gentlemen, and then they will present, and I'm going to introduce both of them and turn it over to them. Mel is the co-founder and director of advocacy and outreach for Nonviolent Peaceforce in the U.S. And Nonviolent Peaceforce is a world leader in unarmed civilian protection. And Nonviolent Peaceforce, nonviolent civilian protectors provide direct protection to civilians caught in violent conflict, and they work with local groups to prevent further violence in a variety of conflict areas around the world, including South Sudan, Iraq, the Philippines, and Myanmar. Mel has represented Nonviolent Peaceforce at the United Nations, where the group has been granted consultative status. Recent UN global reviews, as well as Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, have cited and recommended unarmed civilian protection. The Presbyterian Peace Fellowship honored Mel with their 2010 Peace Seeker Award. The Fellowship of Reconciliation USA awarded him their 2007 Pfeffer International Peace Prize on behalf of Nonviolent Peaceforce's courageous efforts in conflict regions around the world. The Utni Reader named him as one of the, quote, 50 visionaries who are changing our world. And that's good to hear. And the American Friends Service Committee nominated Nonviolent Peaceforce for the 2016 Nobel Peace Prize, and in 2018, Nonviolent Peaceforce received the Luxembourg Peace Prize. And Mel's a graduate of McAllister. That's an introduction to both Nonviolent Peaceforce and Mel. He's a graduate of McAllister College in St. Paul. In 2006, he was honored with their Distinguished Citizen Award, and he and his wife, Georgia Heller Duncan, have, count them, 8 children and 12 grandchildren. So that means he can get to double digits. Next is, after also speaking, there will be John Reuwer. John is a member of the World Beyond War Board of Directors. He's a retired emergency room physician whose practice convinced him of a crying need for alternatives to violence and resolving tough conflicts. This led him to the informal study and teaching of nonviolence for the last 30 years, with peace team field experiences in Haiti, Colombia, Central America, Palestine, and Israel, and several U.S. inner cities. His most recent deployment has been with Nonviolent Peaceforce, one of the very few organizations practicing professional unarmed civilian peacekeeping in South Sudan, a nation whose suffering showcases the true nature of war that is so easily hidden from those who still believe war is a necessary part of politics. John is an adjunct professor of peace and justice studies at St. Michael's College in Vermont. Dr. Reuwer teaches courses on conflict resolution, both nonviolent action and nonviolent communication. He also works with Physicians for Social Responsibility, educating the public and politicians about nuclear weapons, which he sees as the ultimate expression of the insanity of modern war. He also works with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, which works to interest the world's billion Catholics in a modern version of the early nonviolent church. So with that, I will turn it over to Mel and to John, and take it away, gentlemen.
Well, thank you, Al, and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. We're going to start out with just a brief 2.5-minute video that introduces the subject that was used as part of an open debate on protection of civilians at the UN. And so Amy is going to show us that video, so please, Amy.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the majority of fatalities in conflict were soldiers. And we fast forward 100 years, and the majority of fatalities are actually civilians. And so the way we approach peacekeeping and civilian protection has to shift. In a place like South Sudan, where since December of 2013, a very serious civil war has displaced millions of people and tens of thousands of people have been killed. When women are moving out to collect firewood or to collect water or other things that they need, they're often targeted for sexual violence as a way to use rape as a weapon of war. In most cases, we see no incidents of violence as long as they're with a protective accompaniment team.
It was quite a surprise. People with weapons coming in, saying like, you guys go, you guys go. And we said like, we're not leaving. They would hit the women and children. If we had a gun in those instances, we were like, like an armed peacekeeper, we probably would have been killed.
Okay, and now I am going to show you my Zoom ability. And I'm happy this afternoon to be able to share with you an example of a practical and reasonable nonviolent alternative for the use of arms that is working in some of the most violent places in the world today. First, how I got into this. In 1984, I was part of a group that went to Nicaragua during the Contra War, when we surmised that if there were people from Europe and North America in the villages that were being attacked by the Contra against the peasants of Nicaragua, that those attacks would not take place. We started that in 1984. That went on for 6 years, mainly with volunteers coming for 2 and 3 weeks at a time, and no time while one of those teams was present was a village ever attacked. Meanwhile, other villages were attacked. And as we surmised, that was an operation that was run by the US CIA. That came out in the 1986 Iran-Contra hearings. So it was probably the only time in my life that I was glad that the CIA knew where I was. From that started me thinking about this whole concept about how if we were more trained, if we were more organized, if we could stay for longer periods, what could we do? So, as Al already mentioned, Georgia and I raised a family, and I did a lot of work. And then at the end of the 90s was able to go on a sojourn where I started at a school in Oakland, California, where one of the first days I was confronted by a Sufi who was teaching a class on Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet. And this Sufi stared in my eyes and said, "And your job is to enter the heart of your enemy." And I looked at her and I was shocked. But from that moment on, I was challenged to my very core about the way in which I organized the dualistic way of us versus them, right versus wrong, good versus evil. And I was challenged to start understanding work and my life in terms of unity. That led me during this sojourn, a little over a year later, to a monastery with the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who again, at the end of the 1990s, was challenging us that we were no longer at the place in time where we could afford to take sides. He already envisioned the kind of disaster that climate change was bringing and was teaching us to come together and to work together. So it was on leaving Plum Village, I wrote a vision on a nonviolent peace force. A year later, I showed up at the Hague Appeal for Peace with this idea, and I grabbed a hold of a guy with the same idea, a guy by the name of David Hartsoe, who I know some of you got to meet earlier this year, and please buy his book, which Al talked about a little earlier. So David and I started meeting with people and working our way to areas of violent conflict around the world, really for the next couple of years, maxing out our credit cards. And what we found was the idea of a well-trained, unarmed, nonviolent peace force was not an idea that had originated with me in a Buddhist monastery or had originated with David, but was a recurrent vision and had occurred and recurred to enough of us that we were ready to step forward with our lives, our money, our time, our intellect, our spirits, and create Nonviolent Peace Force. So at the end of 2002, 150 of us gathered just outside of New Delhi. We were from 49 countries, and we began Nonviolent Peace Force. At the very end of that, we went to the site where Gandhi had been assassinated. And Gandhi was working on the Shanti Sena, the peace army, when he was killed. And we walked the steps that he took to the point where he was martyred. And then spontaneously, the 150 of us fanned out on the lawn and started singing and praying in our own languages. It was a brilliant cacophony. And then Ela stepped forward and read from the Mahatma's works and sent us on our way saying, "My grandfather would be very happy today." And so that's really the lineage that we come from. And that is what we're inviting you to be a part of today. So Amy, we're going to go back to Amy for a 1.5-minute video. So if you'll take us back, please.
Okay.
War. This is a war. Virus.
We are being drawn inexorably into the era of the war of the invisible enemy.
We've been given two scripts for dealing with conflict, either being passive in the face of it or some sort of aggression in response to it.
Nonviolent mobilization is
actually proven to be twice as effective
in resolving our problems
when compared to violent strategies.
The greatest nonviolent movement in human history has yet to happen, and it's coming.
Thank you. And Ken Budigan was the person that you saw speaking there, who is a professor and theologian and was one of the people at the founding event for Nonviolent Peaceforce. So Ela sent us on our way that in her grandfather's, with her grandfather's blessing. But now we find ourselves again where we're being told over and over that we are at war, but we are not at war. And using those metaphors are always lead to death and to loss of our soul. If you look at how that metaphor was used with the war on drugs, it brought us the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration of people of color, or the war on terror, which brought us endless war and trillions of dollars and millions of people dead and still counting. We are not at war. Rather, we are at a time of awakening. In fact, we are in this together. 9 out of 10 Americans believe that in this time of crisis, we have grown closer. And if you look at the graph on your right and seeing how the number of people who believe we are totally divided has dropped precipitously, while on your left, the number of people who believe we are totally unified has grown. We're not at war. We look after each other. Again, we are seeing how millions of us at this very moment are stepping forward to care for, to protect, to save the lives of people often who they do not know. Dramatically, if you've watched the One More Day campaign, 24,292 people, most of them young people from 102 countries, have volunteered to step forward and do testing which would involve infecting them with the coronavirus as a way to speed up the creation of a vaccine. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating that that's the way that we should go with creating vaccines. John's a doctor, he can go into that more. But the fact that 24,000 young people and counting have stepped forward to do this, something is happening among us, and it is significant. Part of the people who are stepping up to protect others are the people in Nonviolent Peaceforce and who are involved in other groups doing unarmed civilian protection. In the field, we are always nonviolent. We are nonpartisan. We are not there to take sides. That's up to local people. We're there, as Al mentioned at the beginning, to help conflict to be resolved nonviolently and for civilians not to be killed in the process. And of course, local civilians are also always the ones who lead the agenda. We are not there to bring in our own agendas, but to help create the space for local people to live out their lives, their self-destination, and to stay alive in doing so. Our people are specially trained professionals. They work full-time, around the clock, 24/7, just on protecting civilians and preventing violence. We now come from 44 different countries around the world. Half of our people in the field are women. And this is very significant when you compare it, for example, to the armed peacekeepers from the UN, where 5% of the peacekeepers in the field are women. We find that women have a very important role, just as important as men, in terms of violence prevention and the direct protection of civilians. Over half our people come from the host country. We can move quickly. We have multiple methods that we use, and we're cost effective to recruit, train, transport, feed, house, clothe, pay, and insure an unarmed civilian protector costs us about $50,000 a year. Right now in the US, we're paying $1 million per soldier per year in Afghanistan. So we are really the ones who are the fiscal conservatives. I put this up to give you an idea of the kind of methods that we employ. There are a variety of methods that are always used, usually in combination with one another, and always developed the particular strategy with the close cooperation of the local community. One of the things that we do is to engage the armed parties directly. We need to be able to communicate whether it's an armed force of a country or a rebel group. They don't have to agree, they don't have to like us, but they have to know who we are and how we can communicate with each other. And that communication has led us in some very interesting ways. We've had more than one armed soldier tell us, we want to put down our guns and start volunteering with you. One of the things we do is to open up humanitarian access. This is in South Sudan, where the main rebel group there contacted us and said that there were 2 villages far in the bush that had not had medical care in over 5 years or any kind of humanitarian visit. The rebel group felt that if we went in and paved or blazed the trail, not paved the way, that other groups would follow. So this was our first time in, and you can see we got stuck like this 3 times, but we got there. And indeed, people were starving, people had no medical aid, but within a week, other humanitarian groups, Oxfam, UNICEF, had deemed that it was safe enough because Nonviolent Peaceforce had gone in and come out safely. We also provide protective presence. This is a photo from one of the internally displaced camps in the Kurdish area of Iraq, where women and children often live by themselves and are attacked routinely. What we find, if our unarmed civilian protectors walk the lanes of the camp at night, those women and children are left alone. We also, at times, will interpose ourselves when there are 2 conflicting groups that are about to converge on each other. But we don't do this without a lot of homework in advance. This is a scene from Mindanao, where a village was being converged upon by the armed forces of the Philippines on the one side and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front on the other. The people started to panic. They started to pack and to flee. But the elders called our team, and you can see our team sitting there, who were nearby. And so our team said, well, we'll be there. And en route, because you have the armed groups on speed dial, we called the local commander of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. We called the local commander of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and we said, you know, your guys are coming on this village. People are about to flee. We know you don't want that to happen. We also know that you know it would be a violation of the ceasefire that was then in force. And so to make sure that it doesn't happen, our team will come and stay in the village until your guys back off. By the time we got there, both forces had backed off. And in this case, 700 people were able to stay home. I have a lot of stories, but I know our time is fleeting. But let me just tell you one more story. This takes us back to South Sudan, where, as Al said, there has been a bloody civil war that reignited at the end of 2013. There is some hope there. There's been a very fragile peace agreement that has been signed and is being implemented. And so we are there working to support that peace agreement at this point. Right now we have about 200 people on the ground. John, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, was a part of that group last year. And this is from the book, Next Time They Come, They'll Come to Count the Dead, by Nick Terse. And he describes an area in the northern part of South Sudan where there were at that point a armed group from Sudan, from Darfur coming in. There was the main rebel group, and there was the army of the government, all converging at the same time. So Nick picks it up where he's quoting Sheldon, one of our nonviolent peacekeepers. And Sheldon says, "We just got information that about 60 women and children were at the airstrip 2 miles south of our location. So if you can imagine, to the north of us, within 8 kilometers, we have opposition force coming in our direction. And then to the south of us, 1 kilometer is the government's front line. And 1 kilometer beyond that is the airstrip. So you know that the women and children that are stuck at that strip are not able to go right, and they're not able to go left. And there's a looming attack at any moment. And these people are going to be trapped right in the middle." So he and Callista go, they're in a UN camp for internally displaced people. They tell the head of the UN that these people are in fact trapped at this airstrip, and the head of the UN force says no one is leaving this area, and they refused to do so. So Callista and her colleague came back, got in our Land Cruiser, and we pick it up with Sheldon saying, "I pull out and make a left-hand turn out of the base towards the south, and right off the bat, we're faced with 2 tanks and 4 technicals." Sheldon remembers, using the standard slang term for the war chariot of the developing world, the light pickup truck with a machine gun mounted in its bed. In this book, Sheldon goes on to talk about how they go through 2 checkpoints and get to the airport. And by this time, it's raining, it's very muddy, and night is starting to fall. Nick describes the scene. It doesn't take very long for Wardwell and Pierce to reach the airstrip, which is when they first spot the trapped civilians. A tiny girl wearing a peach dress with a floral print sleeves, suitable for Easter Sunday. A boy in a brown t-shirt, jeans cut to shorts just below his knees. Young women in cotton print dresses. Small children perched on their hips. Others toting oversized rectangular bags. When these 72 people see this Toyota Land Cruiser, they start to run. And of course, we can't get 72 people in. But miraculously, Sheldon and Callista were able to get 27 people into that Land Cruiser. And they took off back through the checkpoints, back to the camp. The people got off, and Sheldon and Callista knew that they had to turn around and go back. By this time, it was getting very muddy. And they no sooner got out onto the road than they got stuck. And as they were pushing out, trying in vain to push out of hubcap deep mud, they say, "As we're doing this, guess who shows up at the airstrip? A UN convoy with a big truck, an armed UN convoy." And then the author goes on to say, "The UN liaison officer had assured Sheldon that under no circumstances would they send personnel outside the wire with the rebels advancing. Yet here they were." Whatever the case, it seems clear to me, this is Nick Terse writing, that little NP had shamed the UN into action. But here, all are in complete agreement. Neither Sheldon, Callista, nor the UN officials will say anything of the sort. So you can see how we can have a multiplier effect in the field and promote others to do their job to save civilians. So I'm just going to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Right now we have a compounded crisis because we not only have violent conflict in the places where we work, but we also have the onset of the COVID-19 virus. And so we rely upon those relationships I talked about, and those relationships are helping us to provide protection for people, not only from violence, but from the virus. This is one of the camps in northern Iraq, where, as you can see, as closely together as people are, the virus can spread very quickly. So we're helping people to learn about basic safety and hygiene. This is one of our teams in South Sudan. We're also doing rumor control, which during pandemics like this, rumors kill people. There's rumors going around, for example, in South Sudan, that Black people can't get the virus, only white people. And so since we are trusted people in the community, we can deal with rumor control to help people get safe. We can also provide protection at food distribution sites, because food is becoming scarcer and scarcer, and these can become battlegrounds themselves. So we are there to make sure that people stay safe in getting their food. We also provide protection to medical facilities. Tragically, 2 people from Doctors Without Borders were killed last week in South Sudan. So these facilities can become targets during epidemics and pandemics. So we can be there to provide protection and accompaniment to the healthcare workers. So I want, before we go to John, I want you to remember that there are more peace builders, there's more conflict transformers, there's more mediators, there's more conflict resistors, there's more unarmed civilian protectors alive today than ever. And that number continues to grow. There is something happening here. And little nodes of more and more visible models are emerging. And we have everything that is needed right now to build a culture of peace that already exists in each of us. So thank you. And John, please.
Thank you, Mel.
Mel.
Yeah, let's see if it'll allow me to share my screen. Can people see my slides?
Yes.
Oh, John, if I can just interject, that's the exact place where Sheldon and Callista were picking up those 72 people at the airstrip. Huh, interesting.
So my story is, I've been thinking about this. I was dreaming with David Hartsoe. I didn't know Mel until more recently, but David Hartsoe and I used to talk about what would it be to have that peace army out there. And so after studying it and reading everything about it and practicing it with Christian peacemaker teams and meta peace teams on a volunteer basis, I was really thrilled to finally be able to see the professional iteration of this. So as I went into South Sudan, I went with having read the story that Mel just shared and all the heroic stories of people confronting armed actors and coming away ahead of it. And I had actually, that had happened to me in Hebron, Palestine, and some US inner cities. It really took me out of the theoretical and the teaching of it and into the experience to see that it really, really worked. So when I went to South Sudan, I said, okay, this is the real big time. This is where I really get that kind of experience Mel just described. And what happens, but peace breaks out. Good for the South Sudanese, less good for my experience, but we're all safer for it. So I got to spend 4 months there last year and visited 3 different teams doing the work, and it was wonderful. While we didn't get the bullets flying like kind of wanted to experience, God knows best in these things. Just flying into Bentu, this is what the town looks like. So a year and a half, 2 years before, this had been a thriving commercial city. This is what endless war does. All the tens of thousands of people that lived here had been driven out and now live in protection of civilian UN camps a few kilometers away. You can see the grid of where this city existed, and so much of South Sudan looks like this. These people really know what war is. And so not having to do too much of the interpositioning and the kind of heroics that nonviolent practitioners are capable of doing, we did lots of trainings. And it was very, very impressive to me to see how well these were received and how with the glee that people came to these things. You know, if we wanted to give a talk on peace here, we have to work for many weeks to get a couple of dozen people to come listen. If you say you're going to teach about nonviolent conflict resolution and some other way than war to solve problems, my experience was people in South Sudan would come by the 100 in a couple of days' notice. And they're just so hungry for peace. And here he's just doing all kinds of exercise in conflict resolution skills. I don't know what that, do you have the marker in the middle of your screen too? There's some kind of funny thing. Anyway, but in addition to doing trainings, which we did with half nationals and half internationals, we also sought out and worked with and took the lead of the local community who was already doing some version of unarmed protection of their own. These women in the upper right who ended up singing the praises of NP in a song had already had a women's group together trying to make their lives better and improve. And they just took what NP has taught them and made it their own and are looking for more all the time. In the lower left, we have Mombasa, a local chieftain on the left. And I learned about the traditional means of conflict resolution and legal system that they had before the politicians with their big guns from the outside came in and undid. And the people really cling to them. These guys are doing, saving lives every day by resolving conflicts in a nonviolent way. And they just loved having us there to affirm that and to support when we could, and we learned from them. And in the lower right, you see a family, there's a couple that I'm have my arms on that were doing community policing. These were folks that were actually on their own, and sometimes with some help from the UNDP and UN police, were doing unarmed patrols of their own neighborhood. Similar to work that we were doing, but totally unpaid. The most interesting thing about this particular meeting when I took this picture was to hear this man, who's my left hand is on, argue with his father, who came out to talk to us about this whole concept as we were discussing it, and saying he thought it was ridiculous that people would go out without a gun. And to hear his son stand up to him and said, if we had guns, we'd all be dead. And they got it. And this was with, this is the kind of support that NP both receives and gives. Let's see. And then, of course, the one thing I was hoping to see, preferably without bullets flying, was to engage some of the armed actors. And the closest I came to was in Rirangu, which was 10 kilometers north of, or 20 kilometers north of Yambio, out in the western, the slightly more lush part of South Sudan near Congo. And there we teamed up with the Interfaith Council for Peace Initiatives, a group of local pastors who, at their own risk, go out into the bush where they find all these soldiers doing nothing, who don't have enough to eat, don't have medical care, and who have this quandary of having been dragged out of their villages by the armed forces. And some of them were taken back and did terrible things to their villages, some of the rape and the pillage and the burnings and the destruction. And so while the villagers were willing to take people who they knew hadn't done those things back into their villages after the peace accords, they wouldn't take these guys back who had done the horrible things, very understandably. And these pastors realized that if these guys stay in the bush, they're the ones that attack the humanitarian convoys to get the things they need. And they're the ones that will most likely be involved if a war starts again. So this was the meeting these guys put together, and I described what we were doing, and the Interfaith Council described what they were doing, and then we took questions. And at one point somebody said, well, we're just helpless in all this. When the leaders in Juba, the capital, tell us that there's going to be a war, what can we do? And I spoke up and I said, it's part of protecting ourselves to hold our government leaders accountable for peace and protecting us. And I said this in there weren't army people there, but there were rebel leaders. They call them opposition leaders there. And my South Sudanese colleague, who you see in the picture on the upper left, elbows me in the ribs and said, you're getting too political, you're getting too political. So I got a little nervous, but then the IO governor, deputy governor who was there, got up and said, we want to thank the gentleman from the United States for reminding us that this is the duty of government. And if you want peace to come here, you have to do two things. Get trauma healing for all these soldiers, for the misery they've been in the field, and find them jobs. Otherwise, when the big guys in Juba say go to war, they'll have no other choice. So that was a great, great learning experience. Just briefly, I wanted to show you that this whole concept of unarmed civilian protection doesn't come only from the peace team concept that began perhaps with Gandhi and the Shanti Sena and the Witness for Peace and the Christian peacemaker teams, but also from some other areas like that I want to go over, at least three others. The peace teams have been the biggest single contribution perhaps. And Mel mentioned that there are 41. Here's the names of some of them that you may have heard of. The ones I had volunteered for were the Meta Peace teams and the Christian peacemaker teams, and learned from but never actually worked for PBI, which is probably the second largest after Nonviolent Peaceforce. But the idea of neighborhood watches is similar. It goes back to the Bible, where Ezekiel talks about a watchman for the city. In the colonial US, I mean, think of Paul Revere and just sending out to protect the civilians from oncoming invaders. This concept actually formalized as the Neighborhood Watch Service in 1972 under the National Sheriff's Association. And you can see most cities have some form of neighborhood watch signs, which can mean anything from little old ladies peeking out their windows and calling the police if they see something suspicious, to something like the guardian angels, who over the course of many decades have done a lot of very interesting things in various cities, starting with the subways of New York. I don't think they're terribly active now, but they have an active website still. But they're part of the picture. And then William Ury, who was an anthropologist and became a conflict resolution mediator, wrote a book called Getting to Peace. It was a follow-up to his book, Getting to Yes. If anybody has studied mediation, it's like the Bible for mediators. And that little book impressed me so much that I could say it probably added $10,000 a year to my income, just having read it and learning how to negotiate salaries and so forth. So I was impressed with what this guy did. And he said, Getting to Peace. And this book, which you'll find under the name The Third Side, Why We Fight and How We Can Stop, is an equally simple way to get to peace. And that's worth a lecture in of itself. But basically, he's saying that in any conflict, the people that are affected adversely by the conflict form a third side that either know the conflict parties or are affected around the conflict parties, that in total are more powerful than the two sides themselves. It's like what the UN or the US can do to stop a conflict in South Sudan. It can almost do it unilaterally because it has enough pressure and power if it chooses to do so. But likewise, the number of civilians far exceeds the number of any armed actors in a conflict, and they have a lot of power if they learn how to use it. And watching people learn how to use it by the teaching we did and the example we set, and showing them how with the work they were already doing in South Sudan, was just very empowering for me. William Ury actually describes all the different ways that civilians can keep themselves safe and prevent violence and resolve violence, contain violence, at one level being the actual peacekeeper that UCP formalizes. Another model is a medical model, and one of my dreams is to meld these two, because I as a doctor think of in medical terms very easily. And Gary Slutkin, the founder of Cure Violence, which doesn't think of itself as a UCP team, but we think of it as a UCP team, and we'll convince them also, is collected a lot of medical literature and took his practice as an epidemiologist, stopping AIDS and tuberculosis and cholera in Africa, back to Chicago, and put together enough material to understand violence as a contagious process. And that again is a whole lecture in and of itself. But the bottom line is that if you stop the transmission of violent behavior and violent acts, the way you stop a virus with a face shield, by putting violence interrupters between fighting parties, which is what we've been talking about, it turns out they get tremendous results in decreased numbers of shootings and conflicts, mostly in US inner cities and in at least 60 places around the world where they've had short-term projects. So with all this great stuff and knowledge and the fact that we know it works, Why isn't it working better? And I don't think you have to go any further than this graph. Look what the world spends on the militaries. It's about $1.9 trillion a year, depending on what you count. That's 2 million millions of dollars. The total UN budget's about $56 billion. You can actually see it has some height on this graph. But then UN peacekeeping at about 8.5 billion is hardly recognizable. Then if you take the alternative to armed UN peacekeeping, which is certainly a step in the right direction for military conflict, and take it to the totally unarmed level, the two biggest agents together, Nonviolent Peaceforce and Cure Violence, you get a total budget of less than $45 million. And to make that show a little bit better, here's the total UN budgets, the total UN peacekeeping, Cure Violence budget, Nonviolent Peaceforce, which doesn't make a visible bump in what the world spends on thinking it's doing security. So getting around this dilemma, I think, is the challenge we have. Why is it that people are so willing to put almost unlimited amounts of money into violence and not nonviolence? And I think it's just the way we've all been raised, the propaganda machine. You know, every war movie we've seen, every crime show we see, the good guys never win by doing good. They always win by out-violencing the bad guys in 99% of the media. And overcoming that is our mission. We have the truth on our side and we have facts on our side. The other thing that we have to think about is, let's get back to the real vision that Gandhi had, which was tens or hundreds of thousands of people doing this work. And Ron Sider, who led to the formation of the Christian peacemaker teams, gave a speech in Strasbourg in 1984 where he said, Christians alone should be able to field 100,000 persons to move in to stop violence. And when I started with CPT on their first team in 1995, this is what I was imagining. And after realizing that vision really wasn't going to happen anytime soon, and I didn't have the skill to do it, I did what Mel did, went back to raising a family and kids, and now getting it back to it in retirement. But this is where we're going to have to be, I think, to convince people that this has much more to offer than more money in the military and destruction and killing of people. So let me share one more thing at Al's request, if you don't mind. Does this, on my screen, pictures are in the way of this. Can you all see this full map? Can you see it?
Some of the sides of your slides, I think, are cut off.
Yeah.
By the pictures. All right. Well, yeah, the point is that World Beyond War has put together this global security paradigm of all these things that can happen. And as Al said, UCP fits into all these. I mean, strictly, it's thought fits best under demilitarizing security, but it actually plays a place in all these. And I really recommend that whatever your peace work is, you take a look at this list and see where you might fall on it, the kind of work you want to do and what you would do, so that we're all contributing to a whole in some way. So thank you very much for listening, and I think we're ready for questions.
And what I'm going to do is make a little pitch here, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A. And Rick, I hope then I assume we'll be able to show the participants and the raise hand feature and so on. But as you know, those of you who know me know that I'm a pretty strong believer in this whole idea that we can get to a world beyond war. And years ago, I met Mel Duncan at a World Beyond War conference in Washington, D.C., and he spoke about these unarmed peacekeepers and how effective they were at stopping violence and saving lives. And you heard about the money that it would cost about $1 million to deploy a soldier in Afghanistan, but at that time it would cost about $40,000 to deploy an unarmed peacekeeper. So it's much more cost effective to have these unarmed peacekeepers in those areas of conflict than it is to deploy military people. And now in the midst of this pandemic, the Nonviolent Peaceforce work has become even more vital. And many humanitarian organizations have left the countries they work in, meaning that there are fewer witnesses to the human rights violations that continue to go on around the world. So in this time of the coronavirus, Nonviolent Peaceforce is there to provide a nonviolent response. They have trained unarmed civilians are intervening to stop the violence. And women's peacekeeping teams are supporting women facing domestic and sexual violence. Community leaders are spreading accurate information, as you heard, about COVID-19 and their native people's native languages. So I'm asking you to consider supporting Nonviolent Peaceforce. I urge you to consider giving to Nonviolent Peaceforce and to play your part in saving lives and helping the world's most vulnerable get through this crisis and lots of other crises, get through it safely without dying, helping women and others to go get water without being killed or raped. And that's what these folks are doing. So now we'll, I hope, turn it over to Q&A, and we'll see if there are some hands raised. So what do we do now?
Al, I just want to mention too, our
Go ahead.
website is nonviolentpeaceforce.org if people would like to go there and make a donation.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Do we have any, do I unmute no, I did that wrong. I just unmuted everybody. I'm going to mute everybody. And so if you have a question and you know how to use the raise hand feature, please do. If you don't have a question, I do. And I guess until I see a raised hand, I'm going to ask some questions. The first question I have is, how does Nonviolent Peaceforce select locations to work and determine the types of projects in those locations? We've heard they're in Myanmar and South Sudan and the Philippines and Iraq and Kurdistan and elsewhere. So Mel, how do you select where you're going to be?
We typically will only go at the invitation of local groups. I say typically because there's one exception. We were invited into Iraq by the UN when Mosul was under siege and thousands of people were fleeing. But typically we will go at the invitation of a local group. And when we get that invitation, we next will send an assessment team. So for example, right now we're considering Darfur in the northern part of Sudan. And so we will go with an assessment team who looks at a variety of things. We'll meet with not only the group that invited us, but other civil society members, with the parties to the conflict, with politicians, with religious leaders, and really look at, first of all, is there a role that we can play? Secondly, are we able truly to protect civilians? Because there are places where we're not. We're not saying this works everywhere. Thirdly, would we be taking the role that really local civil society could or should be doing? Fourthly, are there well-rooted partners with whom we can work and build a relationship? Fifth, is there a way to sustain this so that they're not always dependent upon outsiders? And the assessment team will look at those questions and then bring them back to our board, who reviews the responses and are very rigorous. And then they will decide whether or not we can send a team, at which point then we have to start raising the money to send the team. So right now, in addition to the places where we are at, we are about to send, depending on what happens with this pandemic, assessment teams to Nigeria and to Yemen And we have a ongoing project right now that we're not talking about in Burundi. We're not public about that because of it being such a volatile and dangerous situation. But those are the places where we're looking at next.
And you mentioned Burundi, and you mentioned other areas and sources of funding. So my question then is that the UN, the United Nations, or say the US government or other governments, are they willing to provide financial support to Nonviolent Peaceforce and similar or entities? And then if they do that, does that get into, does that politicize your work, and does it come with restrictions that would, impact your effectiveness or NP's effectiveness?
Okay, we do have a number of governments who are supporting us. Our strongest long-term supporter have been the Dutch, and they are unfortunately right now in a hiatus as the Dutch government figures out what they're going to do with their foreign policy. We also have gotten support from the European Union, the German government, the Norwegians. The Swiss have been pretty consistent supporters. And more recently from the USAID for the Office of Foreign Disasters. In addition, the UN, we've gotten support from the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the High Commission on Refugees, the Children's Fund, UNICEF, and UN Women. But to get us there, to get us into the place where we can access that larger money, we need the individual contributions. That's what can afford our assessment teams. That's what gets us in and demonstrating on the ground what we can do so that we can attract the larger, longer term money. In terms of strings out, that's a fair question. And to be honest with you, yeah, there are conditions that every funder has. They have self-interest, and we, of course, would not take money that would compromise our mission, but at the same time, we work very hard to have a diversity of funding sources, whether that be governments, whether that be foundations, religious groups, Quakers and Buddhists support us a lot, but also substantial money from individuals, because it's the individuals that create that keel for us to stay true north.
Okay. All right, thank you. I see that Cindy Grossman has a question. So how do
yes.
Okay.
I'm unmuted now. Thank you so much, Mel and John. It was a really wonderful presentation, really eye-opening. I am so much in awe of the work that you do and how successful it is, and it's just wonderful. I'm focused a little bit on this pandemic right now. I saw a marvelous talk earlier this week by Naomi Klein and Arundhati Roy. I don't know how familiar you are with their work, but they talked about this pandemic being used. As a matter of fact, Arundhati Roy just wrote a piece that's widely available called "The Pandemic as a Portal." And it's being used to actually create more, I would say, genocide, to do away with peoples and get rid of the people that are marginalized already in society. She, of course, comes from the perspective of looking at what's going on in Kashmir in India. But Naomi Klein wrote a book, The Shock Doctrine, of how when we have a catastrophe like this, it's an opportunity to really go in there and get rid of people and to really do harm to people. It's not lost on me that this morning I woke to news of the Trump administration pulling out of the Open Skies agreement, for disarmament. Day after day, we are pulling out of agreements and any negotiated settlements that we have. So it's a very, very fluid situation under this pandemic and very tragic in many ways. And I'm wondering, you know, just to get back to this issue of the pandemic, you know, what is your organization able to do to shine a light on that and maybe mitigate some of what's going on?
John, do you want to start with that? Start out?
Yeah, that's a tough situation. I won't speak for NP. I'll let Mel speak for NP. And I'll speak for the whole concept of nonviolent action in general. It's really important to keep the vision that you want of the world you want. You know, this is a time of change, opportunity for change, moment of metanoia, if you will, when the world is ready for some kind of change, and that can go in either direction. I think that little video from the Pachi Beni Center that Mel played, it really lays out the choice before us. But you know, what examples do we have? The problem is the people that want to get out of the negotiations are mostly the weapons dealers and so forth. And so getting involved with one of the things that World Beyond War is doing in that divestment movement, and these corporations will listen to threats from stockholders that they'll sell their stocks and so forth if they're going to push this, because there's really no other push for war and all this other than politicians who can't keep their people happy any other way, and weapons dealers. But those people have all the money. And so organizing in different ways, like supporting the Nonviolent Peaceforce and every other resistance to this, is really important. The one place I'd go if you just need to read weekly of hopeful actions from a nonviolent side is called Nonviolence News. Rivera's son, who's one of our advisors, does a fabulous job of gathering things that people are doing all over the world. She comes at least 30 of them a week that will really give you hope. Like 2 weeks ago, there was one of a guy in Denver when a bunch of armed people were in their trucks in front of the state capitol demanding everything open up again. It was just a nurse that's standing in front of her big truck with her gun, just not saying anything, just stopping her from moving forward. But story after story of that, we've just got to listen to those and then pray for inspiration and support that voice that video pointed out, that we've got to go in the direction that of our togetherness and our cooperation rather than the fear and the competition.
One comment, if I may, regarding Rivera's son. She has an uncle who lives here in the villages. So she told me that sometime she may get here to visit with those of us who are not as young as we used to be.
Wonderful.
Well, and Cindy, I think that you and Naomi and Arundhati bring up a very important point, that we do see this pandemic as an opportunity for more authoritarianism. If you look at Hungary, Brazil, the United States, China, it also gives an opportunity for clamping down on human rights and on human rights defenders. It gives an opportunity for the conglomeration of mega corporations and for advanced militarism. And that's a pretty potent brew. And it can take us that way. And as Arundhati was saying, lots of people will die. And they will be people who have been defined by the dominant culture as the other. At the same time, there are alternative actions and narratives that are emerging. And there are thousands of people who are stepping forth, as I said, who are willing to be infected with the virus, to find a vaccine, and we all know, people who are working at the nursing homes and who are working in the jails and who are working in the hospitals and working in the grocery stores, who really are on the front lines and are doing that at considerable risk. And so, King used to always say, the arc of the moral universe is wrong, is long. He's wrong. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And frankly, the last couple of months, I've questioned that and thought, do I really believe that? And what I do believe is that we can bend things certain directions. And that without our pressure, bending it in a direction of awakening to compassion and connection, we know which way it'll bend. And so that's why it takes all of us, whether it's that woman in Colorado or that teen in South Sudan or you, to really be pushing to bend it towards that direction of awakening. And we do, I was surprised to hear John use the term metanoia. We are at a point where there will be significant change. And it's up to us whether we want to be involved in helping to define that.
Thank you.
Other questions? And if not, I have one.
I see Tom with his hand up.
Okay.
I'd like to ask John Reuwer about the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. If he's worked with either of these groups, if they're effective or if there's any problems with the Red Cross and Red Crescent.
I have not worked with them directly. You see them everywhere in at least 2 places in South Sudan. I was told that the 3 organizations most willing to go into a dangerous area before the others were Nonviolent Peaceforce, the Red Cross, and Mel, I thought there was a third one escaping me.
Doctors Without Borders.
Doctors Without Borders, yeah, are the biggest risk takers. And so they're admired for that, and they do good work. One of my team members from France, who I worked with in Bentu, had actually spent a couple years working for the Red Cross internationally in places all over the world. And while I said they're far from perfect, they were pretty darn good. He didn't have much reservation about them. Mel, you may have more experience.
So I can give you an example just yesterday where I was debriefing with our Burundi team earlier today. And in Burundi, it has been considered a betrayal of the government to talk about the coronavirus. And thousands of people were gathered in political rallies in the last couple of weeks. Our teams were telling me this morning that at the polling places, there were people from the Red Cross who had hand washing, water and soap for people to be washing their hands. So that's a candle in the wind, but a dangerous candle in the wind, where people can get killed for doing that. And it was the Red Cross that was out there doing it.
And just for the participants, just to remind you, we normally go to from 3 to 4:30. So if folks start dropping off, we won't be surprised. That's fine. And I don't know, Mel and John, if you and Amy, if you can hang on for a while, if there are further questions, sure. Or if. But I have a question, and that's.
Sorry, Al. There is,
yes.
James McCormick has his hand raised.
Oh, thank you. I didn't see that.
Yeah, hi, Al. Hey, thanks, Amy. Where do the white helmets fit into all of this?
Mel, you want to give it a shot?
You're talking about the white helmets in Syria?
Wherever, every once in a while I read something about these men who, and maybe women too, who go into dangerous situations and do things and often are targeted and shot and killed. And are they part of the United Nations group, or what? How do they fit into the Peace Force?
They're an independent group, and they are. There's actually 2 different white helmet groups. That's why I ask. The one that we hear the most about in Syria has been working in northern Syria, Aleppo and Idlib, I think, primarily in those 2 urban areas. And they do go in and rescue people, usually after attacks. and pull them out, bring them to medical care. I would say that they're doing a form of what we're doing. There has been considerable written information about their partisanship. And I don't think that when you're saving a life, you're saving a life, but I think it's important to have your eyes open about who's doing what. So I think that they do a part of this work, and certainly in what I know of their work in Aleppo and Idlib has been valuable and has saved lives.
That helps. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, that white helmet issue really reminds me of a thing I see recurrently over and over that we've touched on several times today, and that is young people particularly, I mean, all of us have this streak in us that wants to be heroic, I think. Not all of us, but many, many people, and certainly young people do. And I've been impressed over the years, if I take a group of students and just do one of my hour-long lectures on the power of nonviolence, and which includes a description of this kind of work, and then ask a group afterwards if they would be willing to do this kind of unarmed, potentially dangerous work, if they got the same deal that ROTC students get, that we paid for their college education and they had to repay it with a number of years doing this kind of work. I mean, the overwhelming number of them raised their hands. So one thing I have in the back of my mind, it'd be very interesting to do a study of a couple of thousand students, present them with exactly whatever ROTC deal their college would give them, create our concept of the same thing, and then survey them to see if they're more likely to do one or the other, all else being equal. That would be a very interesting study.
Yeah.
Agree. Do we have other questions? And well, then, if we don't, I may ask another question. Okay, war measures its effectiveness by lives lost, people killed, or by refugees created, or by the environment that's damaged and destroyed, or by the dollars spent. How does Nonviolent Peaceforce measure its effectiveness?
Well, we do both internal and external evaluations, both quantitative and qualitative. It's difficult for us to prove a negative, how do you prove that a aspirin prevented a headache? How do you prove that an unarmed civilian protector prevented violence from breaking out? But there are very concrete, specific ways. And John mentioned cure violence. I think quantitatively, they are the most advanced, where they compare neighborhood to neighborhood as far as the number of assaults and killings in one neighborhood where they are compared to the other. We've done that with some villages in Mindanao. For us, our evaluation has to be quantitative, qualitative, and storytelling. It has to be those three dimensions, or it becomes way too monodimensional. And also, we find that we really go down the rabbit hole if we try to prove. Our monitoring and evaluation is much more so that we can learn from our work and share what we learn with others, not to try to prove ourselves to a funder, which is what which is what a lot of evaluation comes down to. And there's too much to learn to just get ourselves into logical frameworks and try to produce numbers.
Do you ever, Mel or John, do you ever imagine a Nonviolent Peace Force or unarmed civilian protection forces being, 2 to 3 million, whatever we have in active military, in the U.S. And imagine, what could we do? The U.S., what could we do with 2 to 3 million of your trained people around the world for much less money than what we're spending with the almost $1 trillion that the U.S. is spending on war and preparation for war?
Yeah, I'll mention two things. Yes, I dream about that all the time. I never get beyond the hundreds of thousands, because I think that really would be almost all it would take. Maybe worldwide a few billion, but in any one place a few thousand. When I was in Hebron for the first time I did this, Hebron, Palestine, back in 1995 with their first team, I was astounded at how much good we seemed to be doing and how much we made people think about whether they wanted to do that violence or not. And I thought, gosh, we just had 400 people here. We could probably make this town safe. And with 4,000, we could turn around the conflict. I mean, those were the numbers that seemed obvious to me from a gut reaction. So I'm always thinking about that. The other thing is the amount of training. When CPT was first started, we took a full month to train. I think that's the ideal for Nonviolent Peaceforce now. I didn't quite get that much. And I used to feel real bad about that, because my thought is, if, to be a grunt in the U.S. Army now, I mean, during Vietnam, you only had 6 weeks, but now it's 6 months of training before they really do anything with you. 6 months. And then if you want to be an officer, you go to an academy for 4 years. It would be astounding to me what we could accomplish if we did that. And I used to think it had to be equal. I no longer think the training has to be equal, because nonviolence is so much closer to how human beings are hardwired. If you read the amount of trauma you have to create in a soldier to get him to be a good soldier and a killer, that takes a lot longer than training people to do what comes very naturally to them. All those roles that I just showed you from William Ury. So if you look at the great nonviolent successes, on a tactical level, they take very little training, more than we're doing now. Absolutely more than we're doing now. In fact, after I did my 1 week of superb training with NP, I thought, I want to do this for a couple of months. I want to get an expert at everything we're touching. And my dream is to have an academy that will do that, whether it's a year or 2 years or 3 years. Now, from a strategic side, nonviolence has to include what Gandhi called the constructive program. You really got to do the peace building. And that's what takes the years and years and years in the professional dedication over many years to do.
John,
yeah, I think about it all the time, and I think we can do it. It's really just a matter of exciting enough people that's where they want to put their money. People are excited about violence. I mean, you read Hermann Goering, and he says, any government, it doesn't matter what kind of government, whether it's democracy or socialism or fascism or communism, all you have to do is tell the people they're under attack, condemn the pacifist, and they'll follow you anywhere and do anything. I just heard Robert Byrd do that, arguing against the authorization for use of military force in 2001. Give that speech on the congressional floor, and then you see one after another just do what Hitler said they would do. It's just,
John, when we get to travel again, please come to villages, Mel and Amy as well. You mentioned an academy, and I think I've told you, John, I was appointed, I received an appointment to the Air Force Academy, which in 1968, by the way, was valued in $1968 at a $75,000 scholarship, and inflate that 52 years. But there is a fellow here in the villages named Yori Okuda. He's a Japanese, he was born in Japan, survived American bombing during World War II. His dream is to create an academy like that, where we train, and he's active in Rotary International. And he wants to help create, that's his dream, is to create that kind of peace academy where we train young people to become professionals in peacekeeping.
There's a long history of that. And it might have been Robert Byrd himself who introduced a bill for a National Peace Academy for many, many years in the Congress. It eventually became the United States Institute for Peace, which unfortunately is not an anti-war thing, because they have to please their funders, who is the US Congress, who is totally unfamiliar with everything we've talked about here, but we're working on it. Great idea. Lots of people all over the world. You know, we're in the middle of this war abolition course with 140 people from all over the world, and that subject comes up quite frequently in many countries. The need for a place to train.
I'm evolving to a little bit different take on that. I'm not sure that one bigger force is better. I'm really moving to a point where, of course, the training is important. What I mentioned, I went to Nicaragua in 1984. We had 2 hours of training, and a week later, I was in the middle of the Contra War. So we have come a ways since then. But that what we really need is to document what works, what are the good practices, what doesn't work, what can be scaled up, what can be replicated, and get that out in a decentralized way to lots of different groups. And they can be larger groups, but they can also be neighborhood groups. That it's much more at looking at the total environment and helping people have the tools so that we don't build huge centralized bureaucracies. You know, when you use the numbers you did, Al, I started thinking about, well, that would bring its set of whole new problems, and there would be new groups emerging that would be protesting against that,
right.
as there should be. I mean, that's the dialectic. But I think that we can be much more effective by spreading out this information as broadly as we can and supporting groups, whether it be the UN to take this on, which they are now more and more, or whether that be that neighborhood watch group.
Yeah, I agree.
And by the way, along that line, that was like the kind of a nice commercial for the next couple of or the next World Beyond War meeting, where we're going to have Manal Fakuri talk about nonviolence training and kind of peace building and nonviolent communication and peace building at the local level in interpersonal relationships. And she does work with that in the Ocala area. And so she'll be talking about that. And I think all of us have seen that in other communities where folks are trying to work with youth, or not trying to, are working with young people, are working in areas of conflict and trying to get young people to figure out, okay, there's another way to do this, to resolve that, to stop the fight or to prevent the fight. Any other questions, comments, or folks want to?
Last thing I would like to say is, I think one of the best thing you could do going forward from here is to try to get this into some other group that you're part of that wouldn't otherwise hear it. You know, as a member of World Beyond War, this makes sense to us, but we really need to reach out. That's Rotary groups, church groups, meditation groups, yoga classes, any group that's looking for something interesting to hear about, I think would be one of the best things you can do to spread the word.
We would welcome, yes, and we agree. And I'm looking to the participants whom I know, and that's one of the things we always discuss is we have 3,000 clubs here in the villages. We have and we have lots of opportunities to do presentations, and we can get this word out with a few more folks who could do some kind of almost you have the presentation almost as canned kinds of things that we could do and take the message out to lots of audiences.
Good.
Anybody else? Mel, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to make, or Amy?
Yeah. We are in a key time in human history. And we have everything that we need to build that culture of peace and nonviolence in this world. It is there, and we can do it.
And I see Larry Gilbert has raised his hand.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So it's to John. I was wondering, being a physician, if he has ever heard of Dr. Bernard Lown.
Oh, of course. Founder of International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War and Nobel Prize winner with Eugene Chazov of the Soviet Union in 1985.
Yes.
I don't know him personally.
So,
I know him.
well, I do know him personally because I was mayor of the city of Lewiston, Maine, and he is a 1938 graduate of Lewiston High School. So we named a bridge between the cities of Lewiston and Auburn, the Bernard Lown Peace Bridge.
All right.
But he and I share the same birthday, June 7th, and he's going to be 99 years old. And he's quite a peace activist and just a wonderful person. And so also I was wondering if you're in Vermont?
Yes.
If ever you might consider traveling, I'm from Maine, so but I'm in Florida right now, in the Villages. And if you would ever consider traveling to Maine to do a presentation with the groups there, or maybe a college there.
Oh, absolutely. You know, of course, the situation of who can travel where, when, changes
Right.
every week. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Well, very good. Thank you. It was an excellent presentation. And so I was wondering, Amy, what group are you with?
I'm with Nonviolent Peaceforce.
Oh, okay. Okay. I didn't know if it was World Beyond War because I hadn't met you yet. So, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
If there are no
Thank you.
further questions, then we'll. I see Tom Miller. Do you have a question?
I just wanted to thank everybody. I thought it was very interesting, and I was glad that we have women part of our peace force.
Good comment. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you, John.
Thank you, guys. That was great. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Cindy. Thanks, Iris, everybody else who's been on the call. And Peter, everybody, thank you.
Thanks, Dad.
Thank you, Sarah.